رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي واللهم ثبتنا عند الموت بلا إله إلا الله واللهم اجعلنا من الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر آمين يا رب العالمين. In our religion, there are two fundamental responsibilities that every human being owes. There's a responsibility we owe to Allah, and there's a responsibility or a set of responsibilities we owe to other people. That starts with your own family, different members of your family, and then beyond that to your neighbor, and beyond that to humanity at large. It's actually much easier to talk about what we owe Allah, because what we owe Allah is very clear, simple, and Allah Azza wa Jalla is always just and fair, so at least one side there's no possibility of unfairness, and that's Allah. And so when the expectations are given from Him, then there is absolutely no argument or ambiguity or lack of clarity. However, when you talk about a relationship between people, for instance, the relationship between an employer and an employee, or the relationship between a parent and a child, or a husband and a wife, or siblings, or whatever else, when you talk about any of these relationships, there's a possibility that one or either side does something wrong. So here you are doing your part, you're fulfilling your responsibility, but the other side is not doing their part. They're not fulfilling their responsibility. And when that happens, it's a very common tendency for you to say, well, they don't do their part, why should I do my part? So the relationships we have with Allah, essentially, the relationship we have with Allah essentially is very fundamental, very simple, very straightforward. Actually, the only possibility of wrongdoing is on my end. And that's why we begin our relationship with Him with the first dua in human history, رَبَّنَا ظَلَمْنَا أَنفُسَنَا وَإِن لَمْ تَغْفِرْ لَنَا وَتَرْحَمْنَا لَنَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْخَاسِرِينَ. Master, we wronged ourselves. If you don't forgive us and if you don't show us mercy, we're of the lost. There's no possibility that Allah will do wrong. وَمَا ظَلَمُونَا وَلَكِنْ كَانُوا أَنفُسَهُمْ يَظْلِمُونَ. They didn't wrong us, they were only wronging themselves. And Allah Azza wa Jal never, He doesn't do dhulm to people. وَمَا أَنَا بِظَلَّامٍ لِلْعَبِيدِ. On the other hand, though, like I was saying in this introduction, people are complicated. And all the other relationships we have are complicated. The thing is, though, that these are very important. And these are things that we're going to be asked about when we stand in front of Allah. Our relationship with Allah, when you fix that relationship, it creates a sense of responsibility to all your other relationships. In other words, what I'm trying to say is if you are very good to Allah, but very bad to your parents, that actually means you're still very bad to Allah. Allah Azza wa Jalla has given you responsibilities to your parents, to your spouse, to your children, to your brother, to your sister, to humanity. And if you don't fulfill those, then you have disregarded what Allah gave you, responsibility Allah gave you. Right? So we have to actually fulfill those rights and those obligations to the best of our ability as well. But it's so hard to talk about. It's hard to talk about because if I were to give this lecture about this khutbah about the rights of parents, for example, there will be children in the audience, and there are young, sons and daughters around the world that have been abused by their parents. That's a fact. There are parents that were not good parents. That is a reality. And when they hear that lecture about how good you have to be to your parents, they say to themselves, wait, but they didn't do anything for me. What did they do? They actually even abused me. There are parents that are physically abusive, emotionally abusive. There are parents that are spiritually abusive. There are all kinds of abuse that happens. And why did they get a blank check? And so when someone listens to one side, then they get upset, how come you didn't present the other side? Similarly, if I was to give the lecture today, the khutbah today about the rights of the husband, then a lot of wives would be upset. What about our side? Why should I give him all these rights? What has he done? And if I were to do this for the men and say, well, these are the responsibilities that we have towards the women, then the men will be upset. Well, yeah, okay, fine, I have all these responsibilities, but she messes up all the time and you don't say anything about that. What are we supposed to do? So you know what happens in discussing any of these rights and responsibilities, there's always a chip on our shoulder. There's always this defense mechanism. Wait, are you going to balance this equation or what? So the first thing I wanted to address is that elephant in the room. Today's khutbah is actually about the responsibilities of men. And that will, in fact, make some men very upset. Because they're going to say, you didn't say anything about women. Inshallah, my next khutbah here will be about women. So I'll make them upset as much, I promise. But the thing is, though, that there's a very natural, and I would even say a tendency inspired by Iblis himself, is that he makes us forget our responsibilities, and he makes us think all the time about our rights. So when you are being reminded of your responsibilities, you say to yourself, well, I don't get my rights, why should I think about my responsibilities? You're always concerned about your rights, and as a result, you are less concerned about your responsibilities. These two things are independent of each other. I know that's hard. I would be the first to admit that's a very difficult thing to do. To actually think only of your responsibilities and not think of your rights. You do have rights, but they are not rights that you only give when or responsibilities you only fulfill when your rights are being met. It's not like that. These are two independent things, especially when it comes to justice, especially when it comes to how we're going to stand in front of Allah Azza wa Jal. So now what I wanted to start with is the definition of a particular word that defines the relationship between husbands and wives. Arrijaal qawwamuna al-Nisaa. The phrase Allah used in Surat An-Nisaa is that men are qawwam over women. Men are qawwam over women. It's a very unusual word, the word qawwam. And that seems to be the foundation of how this unit is supposed to operate. And what men owe women and how women are to react to men is captured in this one phrase. Everything else, it's a long ayah, everything else that follows in this ayah is actually in the shade of this one statement. So if this khutbah is dedicated to that one statement really. Arrijaal qawwamuna al-Nisaa. And that fundamental word, qawwam, and what does that mean for you and me? The word qawwam comes from the Arabic word qiyam, to stand. And it has several implications. It's one of the very fluid words of the Arabic language. It's a very powerful choice of Allah for this word to be used. There are many other words you can use, but this word in particular, one of the things that makes it unique is that it shares its origin with one of the names of Allah too. Allah's name in Ayat al-Kursi, Allahu la ilaha illa huwa al-hayyul qayyum, the word al-qayyum is actually from the same origin as the word qawwam. Now I highlight that for a reason. I highlight that because when Allah's name is being used, qayyum, then we have to understand that name fully in all of its meanings to appreciate the beauty of that name. And also that word itself becomes now sacred. And to take some of its meanings away or to add meanings in that are not there is rather blasphemous. Because it's sacred. It's from one of the names of Allah Himself. Derived from it is one of the names used for what we are supposed to emulate. Now, the first of them, naqidul julus. Qiyam means standing, like not sitting, but from it is implied activity, like someone who's constantly engaged in something. Someone who's never passive. Someone who, you know how there's autopilot, or there's cruise control in your car, right? Or there's a machine that can, once you turn it on, it just runs on its own. It doesn't need to be constantly operated. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the exact opposite. Something that doesn't function until you actively involve yourself. You cannot just press the on button and let it go. And this is actually it's kind of funny, but the way they explain this in etymology is by means of an ancient poem. There's a slave, we used to have slavery back in the day, so the slave is about to be sold, and as he's about to be sold, he says, please don't buy me. And he says this statement, فَإِذَا جِعْتُ أَبْغَضْتُ قَوْمًا وَإِذَا شَبِعْتُ then he says, أَحْبَبْتُ نَوْمًا. He says, don't buy me, because if I'm hungry, I get really annoyed, I'm not active at all. I don't feel like doing anything. So you're not going to get any work out of me. Especially when I'm what? Hungry. And if I've eaten well, I just love sleeping. So, but when he says I'm hungry, I'm not active at all, he used the word qawman. And I'm suggesting here, what I'm trying to tell you here is the meanings of that word include someone who's constantly active. Now that's the first hint to myself and you about relationships. This relationship is not something that will carry itself. You'll have to actively maintain this relationship. There's something, the love between spouses is not something that just carries on. It has to be maintained and nurtured and flourished. It needs to be something that one needs to come back to. You cannot assume that it's there. It can dry up and it can fizzle away. The assumption that something has been forgiven or the feelings of hurt are gone. That assumption, the hurt doesn't go away on its own. You have to work on getting rid of it. You have to fix it. So there's an active role necessitated. Sometimes people are living under the same roof. They're not talking to each other for years. Or not any real conversation anyway. How was dinner? How was work? How was traffic? Okay, I'm just going to watch TV now. And years go by and people actually haven't had any conversation. They haven't built any relationship at all. The only thing they share is a roof. That's all they share. That's not what men are supposed to do. And it's particularly difficult for men to be active in fostering a relationship because we're not much of a talker anyway. We like to just be passive. We like to just come home after a day of work, sit on a couch, put on the TV, or just get on our device and just, I don't want to talk. And she'll come and say, hey, so how's your day? What's going on? Tell me how you're feeling. Says, can we do this later? I don't feel like this right now. we're not the ones that initiate. And we have to be the ones that initiate. That's the first implication. Al-qiyam al-azm. Qiyam also means commitment. That this is why in even Quran, وَلَمَّا قَامَ عَبْدُ اللَّهِ يَدْعُوهُ, in Meccan Quran, it was so difficult to come and stand and pray at the Kaaba because you could get beat up. And so when someone made the commitment to pray, despite all of the challenges ahead of them, the word qiyam was used for it. Similarly, the people of the cave were terrified to testify in front of the entire village because they're going to get slaughtered if they testify that there's one God, when everybody else worships multiple gods. But إِذْ قَامُوا فَقَالُوا, يعني إِذْ عَزَمُوا فَقَالُوا, as Mufassirun say. To make a commitment, to commit to something. Men have to commit to this relationship. And here, this is the real reason I brought up this khutbah. I'll go through these meanings rather quickly and then get to the fundamental piece that I wanted to get to. Qiyam also means thabat, constancy. You have to, and from it actually comes the word qiwam. And qiwam is nizamul adr. Actually, nizamuhu wa imaduhu, the pillar of a building, is also its qiwam. The thing that holds something together, and the thing that maintains, that you can rely on all the time. Furniture can move inside of a house. Walls can move. Pillars can't move. Pillars have to be a constant. We have to be the constant in our families for our women. They have to be, we can't be fluctuating. Yesterday you said this, today you're saying that. Yesterday you said this is okay, today it's not okay. You can't be fluctuating, you have to be constant. And that's one of the other implications of the word qiwam. And finally, one of my favorites, from it comes the word qima. Not the ones that they see eat. But qima is actually value, thamanu shay. That a man being qawwam is actually responsible for letting his spouse know how valuable she is. He gives her value. He appreciates her. He acknowledges her. He lets her know that she's beautiful. And a lot of men actually do the opposite. Let her know how fat she is, how ugly she is, how short she is, how dark she is, how freckled she is, or whatever. And they'll do that constantly, putting her down, demeaning her value. You know, or insulting her intelligence. God, you're such a horrible driver. You're so annoying. Why can't you just take the normal right turn like everybody else? You know, why are you in this lane? Why aren't you in that lane? Constantly putting her down in some way or the other. And a qawwam is someone who gives value instead of taking value away. Like if the woman feels, stupid when she's around her husband, when she feels ugly when she's around her husband, when she feels valueless when she's around her husband, then he's not being a qawwam to her. This is what we have to be, qawwam. Now I wanted to highlight all of this in one particular context. And that is, before we become better husbands and by the way, the ayah is not just about husbands. It's ala nisa. It's actually, this is the kind of thing we're supposed to do for our mothers, our sisters, our daughters. It's actually broadened. And then it's made more specific about the spousal relationship. But the reason I was probed to bring this topic up as a khutbah is because recently I've been engaged in quite a bit of travel. And what I do when I travel and I speak in different communities across, more recently was across the United States and somewhat in Europe. After a program is done, I spend a few hours just talking to people. People just come up to me and they ask me all kinds of questions or share concerns. And overwhelmingly, the women that came and spoke with me about how their husbands they're good husbands, but they allow her in-laws to be abusive. In other words, they live joint family system or whatever it may be, or the husband has his wife, but he also has his parents, and the parents are abusive to the wife, and she has to put up with it. And he says, "I can't do anything. They're my parents. What do you want me to do?"